He thought he knew this forest as well as he once knew the battlefield. The former soldier from the Chechen conflict, who had become a forester, went out on a routine patrol and accidentally noticed a metal grate hidden under moss and soil in the remote taiga. What was concealed beneath it wasn't listed in any archive, and when he realized why this place had come back to life decades after the collapse of the Union, he understood that if he kept silent, someone would surely die. Watch until the end to find out what secret from the Soviet era they tried to bury in the forest and how it all ended. The cold morning was slowly awakening over the Siberian taiga, and the fog lay between the trunks so low, as if the earth didn't want to let go of the night. John Parker walked unhurriedly, like people who are in no rush and running from no one. His gait was even, restrained, almost silent, a habit left from the times when the sound of a step could cost a life. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man of about 40, with short-cropped dark hair and a face where time had left not wrinkles, but hardness. His cheekbones protruded sharply, his nose had once been broken and healed crookedly, and in his grey eyes there always lived an attentive, wary depth. Once, those eyes had looked at the mountains of Chechnya, at dust, smoke, and faces that disappeared too quickly. Now they looked at the forest. John became a forester not because he loved the silence, he came here because he knew how to listen to it. The war had taught him one simple rule. If everything around is too calm, it means someone is lying. The taiga didn't lie, it spoke honestly, just not to everyone. He knew this section like the back of his hand, every fallen tree, every old animal trail, every stream that changed its voice in spring. Over the years of service here, the forest had become something more than a job for him. It was a system of signals. The creak of branches, the movement of air, the smell of damp earth. Everything had meaning. That's why John felt discomfort even before he saw anything specific. The route was ordinary, the far sector where few ventured except him. The reason for the patrol was formal. Old boundary markers had disappeared, and there was a complaint from the nearest village about a strange hum at night. Nothing urgent, nothing that required a team. John went alone, he always did. After the night rain, the ground was soft, leaves stuck to the soil, preserving every imprint. And that's what immediately caught his eye, a track. He stopped without making extra movements. Before him, between young birches, the grass was pressed down, not torn, not broken, but precisely indented in a narrow strip, neatly, as if someone had walked here many times but tried not to leave a path. John crouched and ran his fingers over the stems. They were bent in one direction. Not the wind, he muttered quietly. Wind breaks periodically, animals leave ragged tracks. Here there was logic, repetition. He walked a few steps along the strip. It widened, passing through the undergrowth where neither people nor animals usually go. The branches weren't broken, they were cut. The cuts were even, at the same angle, an instrument, recent. The wood under the bark was still light. Inside John, something tightened, not fear, irritation, the same response that once appeared when everything looked too right at a checkpoint. He examined the ground. Boot prints of different sizes, different treads. Someone walked lightly, someone carried weight. John slowly straightened up and looked around. The forest stood calmly, but this calm was taut, like a thin wire. No birds, no sharp sounds, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Further on, spots of clay appeared. Not local, there was no such soil here, meaning it was brought on wheels. When he saw the first clear imprint, doubts vanished. The track was deep, wide, crushing stones. This wasn't an ATV or a village tractor, something heavy, and definitely not supposed to be here. John proceeded cautiously, stepping on roots and stones, choosing hard spots. He didn't want to leave tracks, though he didn't yet know why it was important. The rise ahead looked like an ordinary hill, but the longer he looked, the more something didn't add up. The slope was too, even the soil layers changed abruptly without natural transition. The smell hit first, fresh, damp earth, recently unearthed. John slowed down, his breathing became deeper, slower. Inside, a familiar feeling rose, the one that once made him check his weapon twice. He hadn't seen the source yet, but he already knew this wasn't hunters or loggers. His past, which he had carefully distanced himself from for years, gently but insistently reminded him of itself. In Chechnya, he had learned one thing. If something looks alien, it is alien. John didn't call anyone on the radio, he turned it off altogether, a habit born not here and not now. He memorized the angle of the fallen trunk, the stone on the left like a cracked tooth, the dry pine on the right leaning a bit more than the others. If he had to return, He would return precisely. Thoughts flowed calmly, almost coldly in his head. Someone uses this section often, cautiously, with calculation. That meant one thing: the forest here was no longer just a forest. When John turned and went back, he felt no relief, only a strange, heavy certainty, as if the taiga had slightly lifted the edge of a veil, just enough to let him know there was something more behind it, and that something didn't want to be found. What exactly were they hiding in the remote taiga, and why did the tracks appear precisely now, decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union? John Parker returned to the hill closer to noon, when the fog had completely dissipated and the light became sharper, more merciless to details. The sun stood low even at this hour, piercing through the coniferous canopy in narrow strips, as if deliberately highlighting what usually remain hidden. The hill looked almost ordinary, almost, because nature is rarely so neat. Its shape was too even, the lines too precise. John stopped at a distance, allowing his gaze to slowly slide over the slope, not clinging to the obvious. He had learned this in the war, not to look directly until you understand where exactly to look. He crouched and scooped up soil with his fingers. The top layer was fresh, loose, dark from moisture. Below, dense, light clay, old, compressed by time. The transition between layers was sharp, unnatural. It doesn't happen like that if the earth hasn't been touched. So they dug, he said quietly to himself. Old memories surfaced, fortified positions, camouflaged entrances, hills under which hid something entirely different from what the landscape promised. Back then, it was bunkers and warehouses. Now, uncertainty. John stood up and slowly moved along the base of the hill, staying in the shadow. The soil at the foot was pressed down, like after repeated stops, not once, not by chance. Here they stood, waited, worked. And then he saw metal, first a barely noticeable gleam under a layer of soil and moss, then a clear vertical line, too straight for a stone and too cold for a root. John froze. His breathing became almost inaudible. He carefully removed the moss with his palm, without touching the surface. Before him opened part of a massive structure, thick metal bars descending into the earth. A grate or gates. The more he cleared space with his gaze, the clearer it became. This was an entrance, not a hatch, not a shaft, full-sized gates embedded in soil and stone. The metal was covered in rust, but unevenly. Old sections darkened, became matte, but in several places the rust looked fresh, as if it had just begun to bloom. John squinted. Where the metal was darker, welds past, recent welding. He didn't approach closer. Instead, he bent down to examine the ground in front of the entrance. It was tamped to almost stone hardness, boot prints overlapping each other, deep furrows left by something heavy that was dragged or pulled. A container or metal barrel, or something even more massive. John noted the direction of the furrows, their depth, angle. Everything formed a picture that made his chest uncomfortably cold. This place wasn't just used, it was maintained. He examined the structure more closely. The style was familiar, angular, heavy, without frills. That's how they built in the Soviet era, reliably, roughly, designed for decades. No decorative elements, no modern alloys, just thick steel and concrete. 70s or early 80s, he thought, the peak of underground construction. They built a lot back then, and not all of it made it into open archives. John felt that familiar feeling rising slowly inside, not fear, realization of scale. If there were gates here, then behind them was space, large, designed, planned. He stepped back and looked around. Tire tracks converged on the hill from two directions. Somewhere nearby was a turnaround spot. Someone had thought out the logistics. Someone had invested money and time. John didn't touch the metal. He didn't even get close enough to leave a trace. Instead, he began to memorize the distance between bars, the height of the visible part of the gates, the angle of the soil slope. All this settled in his head like landmarks on a minefield map once did. He thought about reporting. The thought arose and vanished just as quickly. Too early, too little information, too many questions. Who, why, and mainly, why now? He crouched, leaning against the trunk of an old fir, and allowed himself a few seconds of silence. The forest around emitted no alarming signals, but this silence was dense, saturated, like before a shot. John remembered how in Chechnya he once found an entrance to an old ammunition warehouse, long written off on paper. Then too, everything looked abandoned until it turned out someone had used it quite recently. He survived only because he didn't go inside. That memory held him back now. He stood up and slowly moved away from the hill, not turning his back to the gates. Only when a dense wall of trees stood between him and the entrance did he allow himself to exhale. The decision formed itself, without internal struggle. He would tell no one yet. He would return, but not today. What he saw wasn't in any report, any map he had ever held, meaning this place never officially existed. And such places were always the most dangerous. The morning was clear and cold, the air rang with freshness, and dew still clung to the needles when John Parker returned to the same sector of the taiga, but by a different route. He changed the path intentionally, not out of caution, but habit. In war, the direct path was almost always the most dangerous. Here in the forest, the same rule applied. He moved along a stony ridge where tracks didn't linger, then descended along a shallow stream, letting the water erase possible imprints. Even before the hill came into view, John realized something had changed. The tracks, fresh, dark, moist at the edges from wheels. The soil around them hadn't yet dried after the night dampness. Someone had come here quite recently, after him. John stopped and stared at the tracks for a long time without approaching. The angle of approach was different from the day before. Either they used another vehicle or deliberately changed the trajectory. The second was far more alarming. He moved on, circling the hill from the opposite side. Now he knew where to look. His gaze didn't cling to the obvious but slid, seeking inconsistency. And soon they appeared. The ground at the entrance was disturbed more than the day before. The furrows became deeper, longer. Something heavy was dragged in or out, and not once. Places where they had just stood were now trampled like after waiting. John slowly approached, hiding behind the slope's irregularities. He wasn't going to enter, even the thought didn't arise. His task was different, to understand. He bent down and cautiously peered between the metal bars of the gates. Behind them wasn't a narrow tunnel as he expected. The space opened immediately, a wide chamber extending into the hill. The walls were reinforced with concrete, darkened in places by time and moisture. The floor, tamped, almost smooth, covered with a network of tracks. Wheels, boots, traces of varying depth and direction. This wasn't a warehouse. A warehouse implies accumulation, storage, order for preservation. Here the order was different, functional. Things didn't linger. Near the entrance lay scraps of dense plastic packaging, not household, industrial, the kind used to secure cargo during transport. Further on, a broken pallet half sunk into the ground. They hadn't removed it, meaning it was no longer needed. In the corner, he noticed a metal canister, short, wide, with dark streaks near the neck. The smell was faint but recognizable, fuel. John didn't approach closer. He changed the viewing angle and then saw the most important thing. On the far wall, where the light barely reached, were marks, arrows, numbers. They weren't chaotic directions converged and diverged, forming a scheme, simplest but precise. Logistics. Such schemes aren't drawn for beauty or memory. They're drawn not to err in the dark and haste, so everyone knows where to go and what to do. John slowly exhaled. This wasn't a destination, it was a node. He noted the absence of what he would expect if they worked here constantly. No signs of habitation, no sleeping places, no heaters, no attempts to create comfort. Even the trash was minimal and purely utilitarian. Came, did, left. And precisely at that moment, he felt it. Not a sound, not movement, a sensation as if he was being watched. John didn't turn his head sharply. He merely slightly changed his shoulder position, giving himself more peripheral view. The forest beyond the entrance was motionless, but the silence became different, dense, attentive. He realized he had been standing here longer than he should. Slowly, without haste, John began to retreat. He moved backward so his silhouette didn't stand out against the entrance. No pebble crunched, no branch cracked. Only when trees stood between him and the gates again did he allow himself to turn. On the way, he noticed what he had missed the day before. Broken branches laid too neatly, as if they tried to camouflage a cleared passage, a place where equipment clearly turned around, but tracks were partly washed away, partly erased. He went a bit further, following the fresh ruts, but stopped in time. They diverged, converged again, got lost, as if deliberately confusing anyone who tried to track them. It was enough for John. By the time he reached the outer route, his thoughts had formed a clear chain. This place is active, it's maintained, it's embedded in a larger system, and mainly, it didn't count on random witnesses. Returning home, John thoroughly cleaned his boots, not from dirt, from principle. He washed his jacket, hung it up, checked his pockets. Nothing should remind of his presence there. That night, he couldn't sleep for a long time in his memory. The scheme on the wall surfaced again and again. Arrows, numbers, a node through which something important passed. If this is a node, then there are other entrances, exits, people. And if the place is operating now, someone expects that one day it will be found. When sleep finally came, it was shallow. John woke from every rustle, listening until the sound became ordinary. By morning, he already knew. From this moment, he was no longer just an observer, he had become part of the equation. The sky that day was low and grey, as if the space over the taiga pressed thoughts to the ground. After the second return from the gates, John Parker no longer approached the hill directly. He understood the main thing. The center isn't there. The center never lies in the most obvious place. In war, he had learned this too well. If there's a node, there's periphery. If there's an entrance, somewhere there's necessarily waiting. He began to move differently. John studied not the hill itself but the roads that didn't lead to it. Old forest clearings, forgotten technological paths, tracks that seemed to go nowhere. He walked slowly, sometimes turning back, sometimes making long day tours, allowing routes to form in his head like lines on a map. After several days, he found what he was looking for, a small clearing hidden between dense firs and low larches. It looked unremarkable. If you didn't know where to look you could pass by dozens of times. But the ground here was different, too trampled, too even. This was a waiting place. Tire tracks overlapped each other in layers, like rings on a tree cross-section. Heavy vehicles stood here for long, not turning around, not loading, but precisely waiting. Nearby, tracks of lighter equipment that appeared later and left earlier. John crouched and ran his palm over the ground. Moisture still held in the depressions from jacks, meaning the vehicles weren't just standing, they were serviced, checked, prepared. This wasn't a random pull-off, it was part of the system. He noted to himself the nature of the movement. Heavy comes first, light second, then a change, like handing over cargo, not delivering it. All this reminded him of military logistics, familiar to him down to the smallest details. Inside John, understanding slowly formed, one that made him want to swear out loud. This place existed long before him, possibly long before the Union's collapse. The next day, he went to the district archive. The building was old, still from Soviet times, with high ceilings and the smell of dust, paper, and dampness. There worked Helen Thompson, a woman of about 60, grey-cheeked, short, with grey hair gathered in a tight bun. She moved slowly but spoke precisely. She didn't like extra questions and even less unexpected interest. John knew her for a long time. She treated him evenly, restrained, like a person who doesn't chatter idly. "You're Fox again?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Old maps," he replied, "up to the 90s. She looked at him attentively, a bit longer than politeness required, but said nothing, just nodded and went into the depths of the storage. John remained alone among the shelves. He flipped through maps methodically, without haste, comparing, looking not at what was there but at what had ceased to be. And soon he noticed the oddity. One of the sheets he remembered from previous checks had disappeared. In its place lay a copy, newer, neat, but simplified. Lines were smoothed, marks gone. Someone had edited the past. When Helen Thompson returned, he asked casually, as if in passing, "And the old warehouse zone schemes, they used to be more detailed, right?" She froze for just a second, but John noticed. "Not everything survived," she replied calmly. "The 90s, moves, losses." She wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling the whole truth. Later, as he was leaving, John found what he was looking for in the corner of a folder marked as auxiliary objects. A barely noticeable entry without coordinates, without explanations, only a code. The format was familiar, military from the Cold War. He left the archive with a heavy feeling. Now doubts were gone. The district he guarded had once been part of hidden infrastructure. Not a base, not a unit, but precisely rear, underground, unnoticeable. Such objects weren't built for show, they were created for storage, movement, shelter, sometimes so they could be forgotten. And someone had revived this forgotten fragment. John remembered the welds on the gates, fresh, not restoration, maintenance. That evening, he returned to the forest again, but not to the hill. He just stood among the trees and listened. The taiga was calm, but in this calm now there was tension, as if the past, long sleeping under layers of soil, was slowly turning over. He understood the main thing. This wasn't just a legal use of an old object, it was a return to the logic of a time when secrecy was more important than life, and the absence of a document was a form of protection. Whoever was behind this didn't fear the law, they feared publicity. John clenched his fists. He didn't feel like a hero, he felt like a man who had come too close to something that didn't want to be found. The past doesn't die, it's either buried deeper or it comes out. And this time, it chose the second. The day began calmly, almost deceptively calm, as it happens before something finally breaks. John Parker returned to one of his observation points after almost a week of absence. He deliberately held a pause, let the place cool down, allowed those who might be watching him to decide that interest had faded. That's how he did it once in war, disappeared to check who would start looking. The spot was on a small elevated area from where part of the access paths to the hill were visible, but not the entrance itself. Natural cover, dense bushes and a fallen tree, made it ideal for observation. John crouched and immediately realized he wasn't the first here. The grass was pressed down, not widely, not chaotically, exactly where he usually placed his foot. The track was fresh, not yet risen after the morning dew. Nearby, a sole imprint, light, balanced, as if the person stood calmly, not shifting, and watched. John didn't check the track's depth, he already knew enough. A bit to the right, the branch he used as a natural curtain was neatly cut, not broken, not torn, sliced cleanly, almost unnoticeably, but just enough to open a narrow viewing corridor. Someone studied the terrain, someone studied him. He left there without haste, but inside, something finally fell into place. This was no longer one-sided observation, his presence had been noticed, even if not fully realized. That evening, returning home, John found the gate open. The house stood as always, nothing broken, nothing missing. The door not forced, windows intact, but the gate he always closed automatically was ajar. He walked around the house slowly, attentively. Signs of entry were almost none, almost. On the damp ground near the porch, a barely noticeable boot print remained, the same neat one as in the forest. This wasn't a burglary, it was a message. We can enter, we know where you live. John closed the gate without speeding up movements and didn't call anyone. Panic is exactly what those who leave such signs count on. Instead, he sat at the table, poured himself tea, and sat for a long time, staring at one point. The next day, his work schedule changed, first unnoticeably. One shift postponed, another added. Then changes became systematic. They began sending him to the most remote sectors, where there was no communication, where people rarely appeared, where in case of something, help would come too late. The formulations were polite, reasons logical, explanations impeccable, but John saw the scheme. Colleagues said nothing directly, but he felt it in glances, in pauses in conversations, in unnaturally light jokes. Once in the smoking area, someone said casually, "They say they're interested in who's often in the outskirts now." It was said with a smirk, but the smirk was too strained. A few days later, he noticed a car, a dark SUV without markings, appearing on the street not far from his house. Not every day, not for long, it just stood, sometimes with the engine running, sometimes empty, then disappeared. John didn't approach closer, he didn't photograph, he just memorized time, distance, parking angle. Everything that once saved his life. Now doubts were gone. He had become a dangerous variable, not a hero, not a witness, precisely a variable, one who knew too much but hadn't yet decided what to do with that knowledge. John understood his usual tactics no longer worked, simply observing wasn't enough. Any new action could be seen as a step toward exposure. In the evenings, he began rewriting everything in his head again and again. Dates, weather, tracks, schemes, time intervals between equipment appearances. Faces he didn't memorize on principal faces can be replaced. The system is harder. He thought out escape routes, disappearance options, ways to pass information if something happened. Not in writing, nothing could be left, only memory, only repetition, only internal structure. Fear didn't crush, on the contrary, it clarified thoughts. John felt this state too well, the state before making a decision, when there's actually no choice. He understood the main thing. Silence no longer protects. If he disappears accidentally, it will look like an accident if by his own stupidity, like a mistake. But if he speaks, even hints, even indirectly, he will cease to be a convenient target. That evening, he stood at the window for a long time, looking at the dark line of the forest beyond the village. The taiga was silent, but this was a different silence, wary, heavy. The past he had accidentally touched was already reaching for him. John slowly nodded to himself. He didn't yet know to whom he would speak, but he knew for sure. He would have to speak. John Parker made the decision not in one moment. It didn't click like a switch. It matured slowly, layer by layer, like ice on a river before it cracks finally. He understood. Appealing at the local level meant signing his own sentence. Too many coincidences, too neatly built pressure. Information here didn't linger, it leaked, changed owners faster than could be tracked. He needed a different scale, another distance, cold, formal, almost impersonal. John chose a channel he knew from his service. Not a specific name, not an office, but a structure, distant, multi-layered, independent of local ties. He didn't see himself as a whistleblower, he saw himself as a specialist fixing anomalies. He prepared thoroughly. No emotions, no guesses, no words like seems or probably. Only facts. Soil uncharacteristic for the region, repeated movement of heavy equipment in a protected zone, underground structure with signs of recent maintenance, logistical schemes, discrepancy in archive maps. He built everything into a strict sequence, like a military report. If the reader is competent, they will see the main thing themselves. The contact didn't happen immediately. Several intermediate steps, neutral formulations, technical questions. John answered briefly, precisely, without extra details. He didn't explain why it was important, he just showed that it couldn't be ignored. The response came faster than he expected. Not a promise, not gratitude, questions, sharp, narrow, professional requests for clarification on soil composition, on track types, on activity periodicity. This was exactly what he waited for. He was heard. And almost immediately, the forest changed. Activity in the hill area grew sharply, as if someone switched the system to emergency mode. Vehicles began appearing more often. Lingering less tracks were no longer erased as thoroughly as before. Branches broke, not laid ground was cut with disorderly ruts. John observed from afar, not approaching. He was no longer part of this field, his task now was not to interfere. In the forest, vehicles without plates began appearing. Not police, not military in the usual sense. The people in them looked different, collected, without fuss. Their movements were economical, precise. They didn't search, they checked. Simultaneously, in the district, planned measures began. Closing certain areas under the pretext of ecological expertise, document checks, access restrictions. What was happening didn't look like an assault, it was a siege. Quiet, methodical, without demonstrative gestures. A few days later, John learned that the entrance under the hill was officially sealed. Without noise, without explanations for locals. Just a perimeter appeared, signs, and people who didn't answer questions. The metal gates were no longer part of the taiga, they became an object. Almost simultaneously, other threads began surfacing. Companies no one had heard of before suddenly came under checks. Logging, transport, processing, everything that could serve as cover. Documents were requested at once in several regions, licenses suspended, accounts frozen. The system built on secrecy and inertia couldn't withstand the pressure of speed. John felt it almost physically, like once in war when the enemy started fussing, meaning their plan was breaking. They didn't call him, they didn't summon him right away. That was right, he remained in the shadows, exactly where he should be. But the pressure didn't disappear completely, strange edits appeared in his schedule again. Not threats, rather attempts to regain control. Someone hadn't yet understood that the game had gone to another level. John noted this calmly. Without emotions now, these weren't signs of danger but confirmations. Soon, they did invite him for a talk. Not an interrogation, not a conversation, formally a consultation. The people he spoke with didn't introduce themselves fully, there was no need. They were interested in details, not motives, not feelings. John spoke as he wrote the report, dryly, sequentially. He didn't draw conclusions, he described. When the conversation ended, he understood. His role was almost complete. The operation under the hill was no longer a secret, it became part of a larger investigation. Someone from the participants disappeared, someone turned out to be the fall guy, someone, perhaps, would never be named publicly. The system rarely collapses entirely, more often. It crumbles in parts, losing connectivity. A few weeks later, activity in the forest died down, vehicles disappeared, tracks no longer appeared. The taiga gradually began reclaiming the disturbed areas. But John knew this wasn't victory, it was phase completion. They offered him options. Transfer, vacation, temporary change of duties for safety. The formulations were soft, almost caring. He agreed not to everything, only to what gave time and distance. When he last walked along the edge of that sector, the hill already looked different. The ground was dug up, then neatly covered. Equipment tracks hadn't disappeared yet but were already smoothing with rains. The past was again trying to be hidden. John stopped and stared at the trees for a long time. He felt no triumph, only fatigue and clarity. He had done what he had to do, no more, no less. The last move wasn't his, he just forced the board to flip. Autumn came quietly, without wind, and the taiga stood motionless, as if listening to itself. Confirmation came not loudly and not immediately. No press conferences, no loud formulations, just dry paper, stitched and signed, where under neutral words hid the truth. Under the hill existed a transit node from Soviet times, restored and used illegally. John Parker read the document once and set it aside. He felt neither relief nor joy, only a sense of completion like the silence after a shot, when the echo is gone but the sound still lives in the chest. Someone was detained. Surnames flashed briefly, without details, several executors, one intermediary, a couple of former leaders. Others disappeared, dissolved as if they never were. That's how it always is when the chain is longer than the official version allows itself to admit. Justice turned out incomplete but real. A week later, John was invited for a talk. The office was bright and almost sterile, with a view of a river far from the forest. The man opposite him was neat to the point of blandness, average height, smoothly shaven, grey suit, calm voice without accents. He didn't name his position and didn't ask extra questions. "We consider it reasonable to offer you a transfer," he said, "temporary, for safety." The words were soft, but the meaning unambiguous. John nodded. He didn't argue or agree immediately. He asked one question. "How long?" The answer was honest. As it turns out. So John left the forest. The city accepted him indifferently. Noise, concrete, straight lines. Here everything was in plain sight, but precisely because of that, much remained unnoticed. He worked with papers, consulted, sometimes went on formal checks. People around were polite, but the distance was always felt. Without the forest, he became different, not weaker, emptier, like a person deprived of the language in which he thought. Nights, he dreamed of the taiga, not the gates, not the hill, just the sound of wind, steps on needles, the sense of space where you can breathe deeply. He understood he had lost not a place but part of himself. Time passed. Months formed a neat row. When they finally allowed him to return, it was almost routine, without celebrations, without warnings. He packed quickly, as if he had been waiting all this time. The forest met him differently. He went to the hill not immediately, gave himself a day, then another, and only on the third went, not out of curiosity, out of respect. The gates were gone. The place where they were was filled and tamped. The ground still held equipment tracks, but grass was already pushing through softly, stubbornly. No signs, no fences. Everything was done so that in time only the hill shape remained and nothing more. John stopped and stood silently for a long time. He felt no anger, only quiet sorrow mixed with understanding. The past was again tried to be hidden, more carefully, deeper. Officially, the forest began healing the wound. In time, ruts disappeared, tracks smoothed, moss returned to stones. For an outsider's eye, this place became ordinary. Even he, if he didn't know, could pass by. But memory didn't yield to restoration as easily as soil. John continued his work. He listened to the taiga again, read its signs. But now he knew that under the roots could hide not only stones, and that danger doesn't always come with noise. One day, a young inspector approached him, tall, lanky guy with an open face and 2 quick movements. He asked about old routes, about places where few went before. John looked at him attentively. "Why do you need that?" he asked calmly. The guy got embarrassed, shrugged. "Just curious." John didn't lecture. He just said, "The forest remembers everything, and if something seems too quiet to you, listen more carefully." The guy nodded, not fully understanding. Someday he would. In the evening, John stood again on the trail where he once noticed the first pressed grass. The wind stirred the crowns. Birds returned to nests. Everything was as before, and wasn't. He understood the main thing. Protecting the forest means protecting not only trees and animals. It means being a guardian of what people try to hide, counting on time for oblivion. But the forest doesn't forget, it just waits. And if one day the silence becomes too dense again, if the earth speaks in an alien language again, John Parker will be there. He will listen. God doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes he speaks through silence, through the feeling that something in this world shouldn't be as it is. John just listened, and that's what became a small miracle, to choose truth over convenient silence, even when it's scary. In our lives, we too hear this quiet voice. Don't ignore it. Perhaps through it, God leads you. If this story resonated in your heart, share it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new stories. May the Lord bless you and keep you.